Hi, and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. As we discover almost weekly, anybody that takes an airplane in this country, we have a very, very big country, lots of landmass surrounded by oceans on three sides, a population that's spread out from coast to coast. And air travel really is essential for everything. It doesn't matter, business, tourism, trade, connecting remote communities, and of course, families, not to mention the fact that people go to work. So we are very, very dependent on airlines to move people, and not all of us have private jets, like the Prime Minister. So it gets a little bit more complicated, but it's simply not working. So we have turned to Duncan Dee. Now, this man has a very interesting history at Air Canada. He did almost every job, but he did end up as the chief operating officer of Air Canada. So he actually knows what he's talking about. And he testified in front of the Senate Transport Committee on some of these related issues. So it's I'm very pleased to have Duncan Dee with us today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Senator.
This is great. So, just because I could tell you this story every week, but I'll just tell you yesterday, it took me 22 hours to get from Saskatchewan, from Saskatoon to Ottawa, arriving at 3 o'clock in the morning in the Ottawa airport. It just doesn't work anymore. Can you give us a little diagnosis of what's wrong with this patient?
Look, as you've noticed over the last year, as many Canadians who have traveled over the last year and a half, the situation in Canada is almost out of control. If you
Yep.
take a look at what happened last summer, for example, Canada's three largest hubs wound up not on the top 10 list on the continent, but the top 10 list in the world for delays. So when you've got Toronto as number one last summer, Montreal number two, and Vancouver number 10 in the world for delays, that means when you've got a system like Canada's, where virtually every aircraft goes through one of those three airports at some point in their day, the Reginas and the Saskatoons and the Monktons and the Halifaxes all end up seeing delays as well. So it's one of these inevitable things. And when you take a look at what's going on in particular to the situation you just described, between Saskatchewan and the nation's capital in Ottawa, many of the direct nonstop flights that existed prior to the pandemic no longer exist.
Yeah,
So
canceled.
canceled, they no longer exist. And so what ends up happening is a lot more of the flights that you used to be able to count on to arrive close to schedule, if not always, most of the time, are now dependent on going through the hubs, which makes those flights even riskier than before. So your flight to Saskatoon, getting into Toronto late, means that your connection to Ottawa is, in the industry's terms, busted, meaning you
Yeah.
can no longer take that flight and you now have to scramble to take the next available flight. And if that flight is delayed because that aircraft is coming from somewhere else, you arrive at 3 a.m. at Ottawa Airport when there are no services available. So you better be lucky if you've booked something in advance to pick you up, to take you to where you're going. Because if you don't, then at 3 a.m., you're pretty much trying to figure out how to get to where you need to go. And
Well,
this,
and one of the other things I saw last night was literally there were 10 couples, 8 to 10 people with wheelchairs and needing assistance arriving at 3 in the morning. Now, it's kind of a separate issue that whether we need a rule that says if you're not physically able, you may have to travel with somebody who can help you out. But I'm sure that's against the Constitution or any other number of laws I can think of.
well, and airlines are paid by those travelers to provide them with wheelchair service.
Yeah,
So the fact that they weren't given the wheelchair service, not
I
only
think they got it. It's just at 3 in the morning. How are you going to deal with 8 people?
exactly. So we get back to why this is happening now, and I
Yeah.
think that we've got a situation in Canada that is unique. In the United States, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was passed by Congress and signed by President Biden last year, allocated 25 billion US dollars to airport infrastructure. So, terminals, taxiways, runways, de-icing equipment, things like that are being funded because of this bipartisan infrastructure bill. In Canada, we don't have that. And so what we're finding now in Canada is a situation where airports are not able to do wholesale improvements to their facilities, and they're doing it piecemeal. So if you take a look at what's happening in Toronto as we speak right now, many taxiways are closed. And so, for things like towing of aircraft between gates at Pearson Airport, it's even more complicated now because instead of having one taxiway to go through for many of those aircraft, they're left with none. They're left with few. And so we're in a situation where those are short-term problems which are causing this delays, but it doesn't bode well for travelers, especially in places like Saskatchewan or New Brunswick or outside the main centers.
Because I'm going to cast my mind back in fact, the best flights I took were during COVID because, of course, the planes were clean and they weren't crowded. But this has been going on and building for a long time. There were issues well before COVID in terms of, the joke that went around with Air Canada. Their motto was, we're not happy until you're not happy. And people were experiencing that everywhere.
Well, things I think, in terms of air transportation in Canada has been a policy mess for a very, very long time. We have never really come to terms with what you said in the introduction, which is that we've got this massive landmass with a relatively small population, and the policies that we've put in place simply don't go anywhere in addressing that. One tiny thing, for example, the United States with 350 million people, they've got the remote air services program, where communities all over the US benefit from government policy, not just subsidy, but government policy, which encourages, stimulates, and ensures that every sector, every corner of the 50 United States receives adequate air service. We don't have anything like that in Canada.
Yeah.
So places like Saskatchewan in particular, and the northern parts of Ontario and parts of the Maritimes are penalized geographically. And we don't have any policy instruments in place to ensure that they have acceptable, adequate service. And so that's something that we've never come to terms with in the country.
I mean, if you talk to the president, which I have, of the University of Saskatchewan, and they're trying to recruit the brain trust from around the world to deal with all of the research that's going on there, whether it's on viruses or canola or you name it. They bring people up from Harvard or other places in the US. They say the university is terrific, the research is terrific. I can't get here. And so they say no to the job. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that when the outside world lands in Canada and they can't go anywhere, it becomes a serious economic issue as well.
Most definitely. And if you take a look what's happened in the last couple of years, Saskatchewan used to have Delta Airlines service, for example, that came to Saskatchewan, but that left after the pandemic. And it's a question that policymakers need to ask themselves: why more international carriers aren't coming to more cities in Canada? Because we do have this thing called the Canada-US Open Skies Agreement.
Okay, so yes, answer that question, Duncan. Why aren't they here? Do we kick them out? Do we make life difficult? What's the problem?
It's too expensive. It's too expensive for many of these airlines to come and serve Canada. The way our airports are funded, the way the infrastructure is paid for, everything comes out of the pockets of consumers. So let me just give you one tiny example. If you want to go through Toronto Airport, the airport improvement fee is upwards of $40. In the United States, that fee is capped at less than $5. And so when a US carrier is looking at potentially serving smaller markets in Canada, they look at the overall cost of not just landing at the airport, the gate, the rental of the gates and the counters. They're also looking at what their customers are going to be forced to pay. And they factor that in. And when they look at a Regina or a Saskatoon or a Moncton or a Fredericton, they look at it and they just say, look, it's really not worth our while to do the 1 or 2 flights a day that we can do into that market, from Saskatoon or Regina to Minneapolis, for example.
Yep.
And so, we can make better use of that aircraft elsewhere. And so Canada has, in many ways, from an infrastructure perspective, priced itself out of that market. And so secondary markets see that, up close and personally.
Right.
Why does Southwest Airlines, which is the largest domestic low-cost carrier in the United States, serve markets as far as islands in the Caribbean, but they won't come to Canada? That's a question I've asked the senior executives at Southwest, and why do they not want to come to Canada? And the number one answer is cost. It's too expensive for us to even come to Canada. And in many cases, they're able to serve the Canadian markets because Canadians drive across the border to catch
And go to
the
Buffalo or
Southwest flight.
wherever it is. And when they
Exactly.
fly into Canada, then they have to have onboard crew that is bilingual, and then they have to pay the carbon tax if they fill up. Like, I'm assuming they have to live by some of those rules.
In terms of onboard crew, they don't have to have
Okay.
bilingual crews. They're able to get around that using recordings, for example.
Okay.
In terms of the only airline in Canada that's subject to the Official Languages Act is Air Canada. Safety announcements can be provided in both official languages by using recordings, which many
Okay.
airlines do now anyway for
Yeah.
both
Anyway,
languages.
yeah.
But in terms of the expense of just operating in Canada, many of these American carriers, for what effectively is a short haul domestic flight, are
Right.
saying we just don't want to bother. And so, those are things that we need to look at from a policy perspective. Another one, Senator, that should be looked at is the fact that in the last year alone, we have retired the smallest aircraft types in the country. We used to operate Dash 8 100s with 37 seats, Dash 8 300s with 50 seats, and Beech 1900s with 19 seats. All of those aircraft no longer operate commercially for either of the national carriers, Air Canada or WestJet, over the last year. And what does that do? It removes markets, nonstop markets, which used to exist, and they suddenly no longer
Exactly.
exist.
No, you're going to fly to Regina and have a flight to Prince Albert, or but now that's gone, right? I mean, those carriers don't exist. The I want to come back to that policy issue, because I think it does need to be dealt with on that level. But there's also these other things at Air Canada, or at I'm going to say at airports, where with Air Canada, you've got scheduling issues. They've got a connecting flight, and the two flight crew are coming off the flight from Moncton, but the pilot is coming in on a flight from Miami.
Right.
So he's late, then he has to go, or she has to go through customs, this and that. Then you've missed your window. Like, it just seems to me that some of the basic stuff isn't working. Like, you can't schedule somebody coming in from the US with a half-hour turnaround. Just not going to work.
No, and in fact, in the last year, both airlines have increased their minimum connection times at airports, which
Right.
operationally makes more sense. But from a customer inconvenience perspective, it takes longer and longer to
Right.
connect through many of these airports, simply because many of these airport hubs are no longer working from a connecting perspective. It's taking longer and longer to transfer bags, travelers, and crews through these airports. And so when you've the situation you just described, where a flight operating, let's say, from Toronto to Saskatoon or Regina, but the pilot is coming in from Miami, in the good old days, and that wasn't that long ago, they would have been able to get through customs, get to that
Right.
flight within likely 30 to 40 minutes. Now it's
Yeah.
upwards of 90 minutes for them
Yeah.
to get through that entire process. And so, again, these are things that we need to fix from a procedural perspective. And one tiny thing I think for Saskatchewan in particular is the fact that the federal government recently announced this new verified travel program from our
Right.
favorite agency, CATSA. And they happen to exclude Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, basically every Atlantic province and Saskatchewan from that process. And you kind of scratch your head, because
Yeah.
how
Because they
can you
don't
have
have the stuff. Yeah.
how can you have a national program that excludes basically 5 provinces from that program? And it makes absolutely no sense. The US allows every U.S. state to participate in the U.S. TSA pre-check program. Small communities like Bemidji in Minnesota have TSA pre-check, whereas in Canada, Saskatoon and Regina don't have the verified traveler program. And so we need to ask the federal government, why not?
I literally can get through LaGuardia, which is at the foot of what happened on 9/11, and the reason that so many of these changes occurred at airports in terms of checking and security. I get through LaGuardia in 1/10 the time it takes me to get through Toronto or Saskatoon or Ottawa.
Right. And it's something that the federal government is trying to fix, but they only want to fix it for Toronto,
Yeah.
Montreal, Calgary, Winnipeg, and they're basically leaving Saskatoon and Regina out, in addition to a whole bunch of other communities. And it's
So
really puzzling.
if you're me, and if you're a lot of people who try to fly to Saskatchewan, or you in New Brunswick, or whatever it may be, you kind of end up feeling like, is this a conspiracy? Do they actually sit at headquarters and say, who gives a damn? There's only 1 million people there, or there's only a couple of million people. We get more, people going through Toronto. So to hell with them. If they get a flight a day or it's in the middle of the night, who cares? Do they actually think that way?
I don't believe I ever thought that way, and I certainly don't think any of them think that way, because the 10 or 20 people traveling from Toronto to LaGuardia, for example,
Yeah.
originated somewhere. They originated
Yes.
in Regina, and they originated in Saskatoon and Prince Albert and elsewhere throughout the country. And that's the only way you can, within the airline business, become profitable, is by ensuring that you have a large enough network that supports flights like LaGuardia and flights like Heathrow and
Yeah.
flights like Paris. And so when you take a look at that situation, I can't believe anyone in the sector looks at Saskatchewan and says, well, they're an afterthought. But the one thing that builds into
Feels like
that,
it.
and the reason why it feels that way is because of the way we conduct ourselves in terms of public services and public policy. When
Yeah.
the federal government, sorry,
Go ahead.
when the federal government can't be counted on to treat Saskatchewan like it would treat Ontario or Alberta or BC in terms of a security program, how
Yeah.
can you expect private sector companies to treat Saskatchewan like they would treat BC and Alberta and Ontario? You know, and that really, to me, was the biggest wake-up call in the last little while about how the federal government approaches these infrastructure issues, these process issues, these procedure issues, where the minister holds an announcement at Toronto Airport, um, you know, uh, proudly proclaims to the world that he's got this new verified traveler program, but it's only available at 6 airports. And by the way, Saskatchewan is left out, and so is all of Atlantic Canada. And so, why is that? And so we wonder why private companies like Air Canada or WestJet treat the regions in a different way, when the federal government, which is supposed to treat every
Treats them
region the
in a
same way,
different way.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I
No,
think we
that's
need.
what you wonder, because it's kind of like the signal, I mean, I suppose it might change around, although I haven't seen that, but Liberals don't get elected in Western Canada, so they don't care. They don't pay that much attention. And then that kind of gives Air Canada or private companies the right to say, well, we're not going to get too much heat there, because it's not an area they care about.
Look, I mean, at the end of the day, I think the way the country is served in terms of air service largely depends on the way the structure is created by public policy. And when I sat on the Canada Transportation Act review panel, which is conducted every decade, so the next
Yeah.
one is about a year and a half away.
Okay, good to
you know,
know.
one of the things that came loud and clear, and one of the things that we ensured was part of our report, was this notion that Canada's global air traffic network is just not really served right across the country and across the regions. We've got these 3 hubs of Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, and everything beyond those markets, and now to a lesser degree Calgary, but everything beyond those main markets tends to be secondary in nature. And it's been that way for quite some time. But it's something which I think Canadians, especially those who don't live in those provinces, need to speak up more about. It's something that needs to be heard whenever these decisions, important decisions affecting infrastructure and transportation, are made. And I know, you're somebody who's been vocal about this, even from the time you weren't in the Senate. And I still remember the phone calls from Consul General Wallin and not Senator Wallin about service between the United States and Saskatchewan. And so, you've been a long time.
Well, never mind the two capitals. You can't get from Ottawa to Washington.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, in all of the hats you've worn, this is something that's been close to your heart. But unfortunately, it's not something which everyone feels as strongly about as you do. And I think, just listening over the last little while to your podcast, it's not just air transportation, it's many, many things.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues there. So let's do some detail stuff, just because I'm coming back to policy. I really am. We need some big picture. But just from your point of view, why does it take 45 minutes or maybe an hour to get your luggage? And this is true in almost any airport. And that's if the luggage actually arrives and has not been lost, because that's also a separate issue. But what's going on? Is that a staffing shortage? Is that machines that don't work? Like, what's your sense of that?
This is something which this is the code that airlines haven't been able to crack in Canada for a long time. This is not a pandemic related problem. This predates the pandemic for years. And one of the things that we looked at in terms of why, for example, does Delta Airlines, why are they able to guarantee your bags to be on the baggage belt within 20 minutes of arrival, whereas that's something that is impossible to do in Canada, even for bags that have priority stickers because they're in business class. And so why is that a problem? And if you drill down below the issues, it's not a staffing issue, because they have the same number of crews that are greeting the flight when the aircraft arrive. It's basically a process design issue. So when an aircraft is offloaded, when the bags are offloaded the aircraft, and the crews have to put the bags onto the baggage belts that eventually take your bags through the bowels of the airport onto the carousel, that process doesn't belong to the airline, it belongs to the airports. And in many cases, we've got a situation in the country where it's like, one of my former colleagues used to call it the air transportation salute. Who's responsible? It's them. And so we need to really ensure greater accountability. And the one thing that I think is progressive from what the minister has recently announced is data sharing. And so hopefully that will include things like baggage data, because we need that data to drill down and to ensure that we have the right processes, procedures, and infrastructure in place to prevent these from happening. As you said, why does it take 45 minutes for a bag to be delivered in any airport in the country, when you go to an airport you're familiar with, LaGuardia Airport, one of the busiest airports in the United States, and Delta has a guarantee that they will deliver your bag within 20 minutes. But then that creates another set of problems, because when Canadian travelers don't have much faith in the checked baggage system, they then bring carry-on bags.
They call them all on board. That's right.
And then that creates a whole other set of delays.
We spend on every flight I'm on, I bet we spend 20 minutes when we're supposed to be taking off, when we're supposed to be backing up, arguing with everybody that their bag has to now be checked and taken off the plane and then handed through the door to somebody. Like, if Air Canada did that at the bottom and say, look, we're going to give you a discount on because people take their bags up because it's cheaper, because when they get upstairs, they're not charged for checking their bag. And, also they don't want it lost. So if Air Canada just said, look, we promise we'll get it there, and and then we won't have this problem trying to get big bags on small planes.
But Senator, it goes back to the main issue that you pointed out, which is if it's taking 45 minutes
Yeah,
for a checked bag to get onto the carousel, nobody who will want to check their bag because they don't want to get to their destination and
yeah,
spend 45 minutes waiting at the carousel. It's like watching paint dry when you're
yeah,
seeing that carousel turn around and bags aren't coming out. And so
yeah.
we need to fix that basic issue before we can even get to the issue of let's try to minimize the number of carry-on bags that travelers bring onto the aircraft. The reason why they're doing that is because they don't trust the checked baggage
Yeah, no,
process.
no, absolutely. The question of security and staffing. So security. So in Toronto now, for example, I don't have to take my computer out of my bag.
Right.
Most other airports, I have to take it out of my bag. Some you take your shoes off, some, the whole 9 yards, belts, all of this. Um, is part of the problem that nobody wants to be the leader or the politician that says a lot of that stuff after post 9/11, we were in a totally reactive frame to the shoe bomber or this or that, and nobody wants to be the person that says, let's really target, as the Israelis do and others, let's do our security homework, target the bad guys, and let granny and your 2-year-old go through security without a strip search.
Well, look, I mean, I think the situation you described in Toronto, where you no longer have to take out your computer and your
Yeah,
liquids from your carry-on bags because you're a trusted traveler, has to go national. As I
yeah,
mentioned earlier,
yeah. No,
the
no,
the
exactly.
fact that we've got huge swaths of the country that are out of this program makes
Yeah,
absolutely no sense. But again, this is something that you actually have pointed out often before is the lack of consistency. You
yeah,
know, you can go to the same airport on a different day and have
yeah,
different rules imposed on you. And when you see that multiplied by the number of travelers traveling every single day, you can just see the amount of time wasted because
yeah,
of the rules that are made up on the fly. And one of the things which security services, airport security services all over the world have tried to really focus in on is consistency. Whereas in
yeah,
Canada, we've basically, thrown that by the wayside. And I think, as you mentioned, this was in reaction to the post 9/11 environment where we were creating many of these rules on the fly, and no one has really gone back and reviewed many of these rules since that time.
yeah,
But in many other countries, while maintaining these rules, they've also added new technology to the
yeah,
process, which makes it so much simpler. In many countries now, they've got liquid explosive detection sniffers, which means that you can carry your regular sized shampoo through
yeah.
the security checkpoint. But in Canada, we still want people to bring the travel size shampoo.
Oh, and
And
they spend 10 minutes measuring it, right? Like it's
well, the one thing I found, and you probably found this when you were traveling across the border, is when the CATSA agent is looking at your bottle, trying to convert the ounces into
milliliters.
milliliters because they can't
Right.
make the conversion quickly. And
No,
so
no, it's crazy.
and so you just add all of this up. And so for travelers like you who travel so frequently across the country, you see every day how all of these delays, small delays, add up over time. And you end up with a 3 a.m. arrival in
Yeah,
Saskatoon or a 3 a.m. arrival in Ottawa, because
in Ottawa,
throughout
yeah.
the rest of the day, it just accumulates and cumulatively results in these cascading delays throughout the day.
I certainly think that staffing is an issue. Everybody is young and inexperienced. I think a lot of people who were fired or laid off during COVID didn't come back. I think because you just see people in training all the time on the security lines behind the desk. My favorite story is this was a couple of months ago. So we're all ready to go. The pilot even says we're ready to go, and they can't find anybody in Pearson Airport in Toronto to close the door of the plane.
Right.
And they've been phoning, and now it's an hour and 5 minutes. And I hear the pilot on the phone sitting in the cockpit, and he goes, yes, I could go out and close the door of the plane, but I'm the pilot. I need to be in the plane. And I thought, he's talking to somebody in operations looking for a person, and he's explaining that. That is frightening.
Well, look, I mean, the number of experienced staff that left during the pandemic is not something to be overlooked. That's
No.
something which is even more pronounced in the air navigation service provider, Nav
Yep.
Canada. And they're now in the midst of trying to hire enough air traffic controllers to replace the ones who retired. The one problem with that is that the ones who retired, as you mentioned, were the most experienced and productive air traffic controllers, and the ones that they're bringing in are fresh, brand new, and
Yep.
they're obviously well trained and experienced, but they haven't had that the exposure to the air traffic
Their
control
hands
system.
dirty, dealing with a crisis. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think this is something which hopefully time will be able to fix. But it doesn't address the fact that, for example, last summer, and hopefully this is not going to happen again this summer, CATSA was short, um, you know, almost 1,000 screeners across the country in time for the summer peak, and they didn't start hiring them until well into June and July. And so we never actually saw a full complement of screeners at the airports until well into the summer peak, when people were already being advised to check in 3 hours ahead of time just to be able to get through security for their flights. And
And
so
there's, sorry, go ahead.
no, and so I think a lot of this also goes back to planning.
Yeah.
So yes, there's a staffing issue, but people should have known that, because much of these decisions are data driven. You know how many seats you're selling in the marketplace, and how many travelers are expected because of that number of seats you've got in the marketplace. So why aren't you hiring people to be able to process that number of travelers, especially during the peak periods?
And we're told that there is something like, and I'm not sure the exact number, 20 to 25,000 pilot shortage in Canada, because people are retiring out. You need to bring them in. There's new planes. They've got to be at different stages. There's international. Like, you don't think, because none of us can find a flight anywhere we want, that there's that many pilots. But Air Canada in particular, but also WestJet, they go a lot of different places.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a global problem. We're
Yeah.
seeing a global pilot shortage, and it's very acute in many countries, including Canada and in the United States. The one thing I've got to say, though, is in Canada, the airlines that are most impacted by this pilot shortage are the smaller regional carriers, the
Right.
operators who serve the
Right.
remote communities. Because if
Yeah.
you go to any pilot school in the country or any airline in the country and you ask pilots where they want to work, to a person, they're going to say WestJet or Air Canada. So
Yeah.
WestJet and Air Canada don't generally see pilot shortages, and they shouldn't. So when you see situations like that, then we would be in real trouble if we end up in a situation where the biggest airlines aren't able to hire pilots when they want them. So I think that's something that we need to keep an eye on, and it's something again that policy levers can be pushed to ensure that we don't end up in a critical situation where pilot shortages result in flight disruption and cancellation.
Okay, on the policy side, I want to come to competition in a moment, but this is there a different way for airports and airlines to work, or the structure, the ownership of airports versus airlines, which just kind of rent the space? But
Right.
one doesn't work, the other one can't, and vice versa.
Yeah, we have a very unique situation in Canada, which no other country on the planet has, which is these airport authorities, which are public airport authorities, which have basically local, quasi-local accountabilities. You've got
Yeah.
boards that are appointed partly by the federal government, partly with provincial nominees, partly with local nominees. So really, no one is in charge. Whereas in many
Yeah.
countries of the world, airports are either run by the government, so public entities, or in many U.S. states, they're run by local authorities. So if something is not going on at the airport that you agree with, you can hold a public official accountable. Whereas in Canada, we've got these airport authorities, which are, have their own accountability frameworks. But, in essence, as you pointed out, airlines are tenants. They're
Yeah.
not, they don't own any of the facilities at the airport. They use the airport under agreement, and it's called generally a common use agreement, meaning the gates, the counters, the facilities at the airport are for anybody, any airline to use at any time. Whereas in the United States, many of the airports have gates that are owned. Air Canada owns some of the gates that it operates out of in places like Chicago O'Hare, for example. Whereas none of the airports allow Air Canada to own the gates. So that means that those gates, aren't purpose built for the
Right.
operation of the airline. And Southwest Airlines, for example, which you had experience with when you were in New York,
Yep. Yep.
their boarding areas are unique to Southwest Airlines, whereas
Right.
that's not available in Canada. So that's something which was created in the early 1990s. The person that created them was Doug Young, the former Minister of Transport. And unfortunately, over that time, one of the biggest opponents of the airport structure in Canada has been Doug Young. He said that
Yeah.
it was something he shouldn't have done. And so, I think a lot of that is crying over spilt milk. I'm not sure that we'll be able to change the structure now, but I think we're at a point where, in many ways, the structure is part of the problems that we're seeing in terms of the user pay model and the fact that you've got this infrastructure that is paid for solely on the backs of air travelers.
Well, the fees are ridiculous. There's no question about that. But when, you've answered this in a way in our earlier part of the discussion that it's just too expensive. But how do we get a little bit more competition in here? Because there's nothing better to sharpen the edges a bit. We saw what Canadian Airlines used to be, and then when WestJet came in and really at the beginning focused on customer service, you were a guest, you weren't some, get on the plane and shut up. They really tried to change the mentality at the beginning about how to treat people, but unless there's some other alternatives, we're kind of stuck, regardless of how we're treated or how poor the service may be.
Well, I think we look at competition in the airline sector in Canada in two different ways. There's the domestic market where
Yeah.
competition is
Yeah.
restricted, and international market where any airline that wants to come and serve Canada can do so. And so the one thing that we recommended as part of the Canada Transportation Act review that I was on was to increase foreign ownership. There's no reason why foreign ownership is restricted to 25% because of the small capital pool that is available in Canada. One of the reasons why new airlines find it so difficult to launch in Canada is they're not well capitalized, and one of the reasons why they're not well capitalized is there aren't enough large enough capital markets domestically in Canada that would allow them to invest in new airlines and sustain these airlines
Yeah.
while respecting the foreign ownership rules that this country's imposed. So one of the things that might well be, Red Wilson looked at it in his competition report a few years ago. David Emerson, as part of the Canada Transportation Act review that I was a part of, looked at it as well. And so one of the things that could help competition that spurs more airlines into the market is, the ability for foreign investors to invest in the airline sector up to a limit. We're not saying 100%, but surely it could be 50% or 49.9%.
We have that issue in all sectors that foreign direct investment in a lot of sectors is a problem because we make it so difficult. There's red tape, there's nationalistic rules that seemed like a good idea in the 70s, but it's 2023. Maybe we should have a new thought.
Absolutely. And, when you take a look at what's gone on in places like the European Union or even in some countries in Asia, where you've got the ability to have local franchises of international carriers, those are things which, maybe Canada should start looking at. But the gating issue there is foreign ownership and investment. And so if you can't fix those rules, then you're stuck with what you've got.
Now, when you talk about, nationwide programs, which the government just declares it won't be nationwide, like Trusted Traveler and other things, is there a policy alternative? Should somebody be sitting down saying, look, this is a breach of the Constitution. All Canadians need to be treated in an equal manner, or at least have equal access to services in this country? Like, how do we go about changing that?
I think this is just the product of a lack of initiative and a lack of imagination by the bureaucrats in Ottawa. Because if the U.S. Transportation Security Administration wants to ensure that a community as small as Bemidji in
Yeah,
Minnesota or Grand Forks has the Trusted Traveler Program TSA PreCheck, why doesn't CATSA feel that pressure? The U.S. Transportation Security Administration felt that pressure because of the US senators from Minnesota or South
yeah,
Dakota or North Dakota to ensure that, the appropriators weren't looking at the appropriations that they were voting for and leaving out their own constituencies. But here in Canada, the federal government seems to be quite happy to just leave entire swaths of the country out. And that's
yeah,
something that needs to be addressed at the policy level because it sends the wrong message to private sector operators and to
yeah,
everybody else that if
absolutely.
the federal government can simply ignore Saskatchewan or ignore the Atlantic provinces, then what's stopping private sector companies, which aren't accountable to voters, to make the same decisions? And these are things which, to me, as somebody who doesn't live in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia or Alberta, that I feel left out too.
Yeah, of course. A couple of points before I let you go. The time has flown by here because you've got so much in your head. 45,000 complaints in a backlog. So
Yep.
it's almost impossible. Like I could launch 3 complaints a day and you throw up your hands and just go, what's the point? I don't have the time or the money to kind of go through this very bureaucratic process. But part of the problem is we're focused on having like changing the complaint process instead of eliminating those things that cause people to complain. Like we're focused on yet another little bit of, bureaucracy rather than fixing the damn problem.
And 45,000 complaints are just the complaints that have reached the Canada Transportation Agency.
Exactly. That's
You
just,
know,
yeah,
thousands more are being sent
yeah,
directly to the airlines, and so it makes no sense that Canada has decided that it wants to fix the complaints process, but doesn't want to fix the underlying causes of those complaints in the first place. And that unfortunately, takes time and money. And in terms of where we are in Canada today, when you compare what we were discussing earlier, that the US government has decided to put $25 billion into infrastructure improvements, and we don't, basically that means that a lot of those problems will continue. Things like de-icing. Canada
yeah,
used to lead the world in de-icing, but now, Sandra, as somebody who travels in the winter time,
yep.
you
Canada has a lot of winter.
and sometimes the amount of time it takes for you to de-ice your aircraft at major airports in the country, that needs to be looked at, and we need to look at why we're not improving. We're getting worse as opposed to getting better, because this is technology that keeps on moving and it keeps on
Yep.
getting better and better. So why are we not there? And
And
so
and how are we surprised every year that it snows?
that it snows or that we have thunderstorms in the summer,
Exactly.
and those cannot be the perennial excuses that we use for the disruptions in the air transportation sector.
I was just looking at one of your tweets. Duncan Dee is very active on Twitter with some good advice on all this stuff. The air traveler security charge is a cash grab for federal government. I hadn't connected this dot. Is that it doesn't just cover the costs of air security; it actually generates a profit for government.
Yes. So the air
Wow.
travel security charge that is actually going up by 30% starting next year. So the government is taking more money out of the pockets of air travelers. They're not even reinvesting all of the money that they take from air travelers into air security. So they get a profit out of that. It's about a 20% profit that they take, and they put it towards some other project or other revenue stream that goes into the pockets of the Department of Finance. I was speaking to the
Wow.
former Minister of Transport, Lisa Raitt, recently, and she was saying that the number one discussion she had when she was Minister of Transport was with the Ministry of Finance to say, why are we collecting these funds and we're not even spending them where we tell travelers we are? They're going to other pots of money for other priorities and not air security.
Okay, now you've got me all worked up about this. Now we've got a new issue.
Absolutely.
It's great to talk to you. I mean, it isn't, because this is so depressing, because you've been working on this a long time and we're not seeing a lot of change, but you're very knowledgeable, and thank you for giving us some insight on this, Duncan.
Thanks, Senator. I appreciate it. And thank you for your advocacy for the regions, not just Saskatchewan, but for the
Exactly.
for the voiceless, because for people like me who don't live in the main centers,
Right.
we look to you for your voice on many of these issues.
Well, we're going to keep at it. Duncan Dee, longtime employee of Air Canada, the former chief operating officer, so he knows about all of these things that go into the airline picture and the airport picture, I should say. So we'll be back to you again. I'm not done with this conversation.
Sounds good, Senator. Happy to talk to
Okay.
you anytime. Thank you.
That's great. Duncan Dee. And that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We will talk soon about this and other issues. See you soon.